there was some particular thing on my mind and I wrote notes about it. And now, just after a week, do you think I can remember what it was? Or do you think I can find notes? I found these pieces of paper, but that's not the note I'm
Fantastic.
looking for. And
But
then
what's on those pieces of paper?
what's on these pieces of paper is what is being avoided. Then there's
Ooh.
I am I have been thinking in more detail about anxiety. I've been thinking that maybe that's a piece we haven't really sufficiently brought into the Authentic Resonance series in any depth. But
Mm.
what was the other thing I've been thinking about? I have been thinking a little bit more about systems and kind of what the work that I'm doing and how I understand the work I'm doing, what that might say about how we create systems. I'm
Mhm.
slowly getting there. I know that's where everyone else has been most of the time.
Well, I think people talk about systems too much because you jump into systems and you really need to see a principle that can unfold in all possible worlds. Like, I think when people go to systems, it's the moment you talk about a system, you can be in jeopardy because a system only works if everyone agrees with the system. And then you create us versus them. This would have worked if you followed the program because systems require programs. Like a system is going to have a program unless it's totalitarian. A system that doesn't have a program that people have to agree to is totalitarian, right? So when you make systems, you basically are going, well, if everyone does this, the world will work. Well, the danger of this then is the people who don't do the system, they either have to be stupid and, or they're uninformed or they're evil, to use those categories from Kathy Saltz, right? Like they either just don't know, so you have to give them the gospels per se. They're intellectually handicapped, so we have to give them a special place over here because they just don't understand, or they're evil and they're going to tear the whole thing down. So systems actually are not that great for dealing with the world because it automatically creates kind of othering. What you really want to look for, in my opinion, is a Gestalt principle, like a principle that everyone is already doing. That if they did in a different quality, that actually is a quality they're looking for. They actually want it. Then that simple change has infinite transformation on a large scale, right? And I think when people go to systems, they miss that. So I mean, I was speaking with Seth. I emphasize conversation so much as the key to all this because people are already conversing. They're already talking, right? You're not asking people to learn a new habit or learn a new skill or whatever. You're asking them to do something they're already doing in a different way. But I would argue that people naturally want intimacy as well. And I would argue philosophical dialogue actually increases friendship and intimacy, right? So you're actually positioning people to get and to do something that they want to do, that if they did it and you change the laws to have classrooms not be trivia structures but oral structures, if you moved resumes to portfolio, all these little things to incentivize the communicative act, this would have emergent profound transformations on the entire system. But it's not a system. It's a change of how something is already being done. And I really do think like there's a lot of constructions of systems or new ways to have society, game B versus game A. There are different ways to word it. And I'm not saying none of that has no conversation at all because very often in those discussions you can have an idea of how to do the economy different, how to do business, and those things can be productive and creative. But if you're talking about the problem of scale, like you're talking about the scaling issue, it has to be a principle that is the simplest of all possible principles that's going to be present in all possible worlds, all possible societies, that is done in a different way that changes the quality of all possible societies. Because all possible societies will have conversation. There is no society that will not have communication. Let me put it that way, right? Because communication is the act that makes the social possible. So I can't even imagine a society that doesn't have communication. I can't imagine a society that's not capitalist or not communist or whatever. So that means it's contingent. So I need to think of a principle that's going to be present in all possible societies and shift the quality of that because that means I can have universal outcome without predicting the future. That's also really important. If I have to predict the future, I'm in trouble. But if I can change a quality that opens possibilities for an unpredicted future, because the way people relate is different, I'm not predicting the future. I'm changing the conditions of possibility that could emerge to the future.
Yeah.
And that is kind of the big thing. Seth and I think about a lot with conversation, faithful presence, democracy. I like that question you were asking, what is being avoided? That's really lovely. Like what is being avoided in people not engaging in conversation this way? I think it is tied to anxiety. I do think asking what is anxiety is a big question. But yeah, I definitely think it's actually very good not to go straight to systems building because you're not thinking according to a principle of modal logic, and modal logic is all possible worlds logic. You're thinking about, you're thinking about a system that will fix the problem, but even if it worked, it would only fix the problem of our world, our contingent world. What about our children's? What about the next? Well, that might be totalitarian for them because they're in a different world, right? Instead, we need to think like a different quality of something that all possible worlds or all possible societies will entail, that open up conditions of possibility in terms of intimacy, friendship, emergence, and so on and so forth. So it's a good thing not to jump to systems thinking, Aspasia. It's a good thing.
No, I agree. I agree, and there has been some conscious resistance to not go there, as well as unconscious. You didn't happen to either of you see the recent Voicecraft podcast, Tim, with Dave Snowden? It's like the most...
Not yet. I really enjoy the Snowden discussions. I'll have to listen.
Great. It was really great. I was touching on some of these issues.
Tremendous.
Yeah, and I'm guessing too from what you were saying there, Daniel, this sounds like some of this is what you and Seth talked about in your recent conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. All right. It's sort of more about trying to find these key principles that, because of course we're not trying to predict what the outcomes are going to be, right? And that's the error that people make. They're trying to design things based on what outcomes they want. Is that simple?
Oh yeah, that's the huge problem. You have an outcome you want, and then you conform the present to make sure you get that outcome. Dave Snowden is very good on not making that mistake. That is a thrust of his thinking.
Yes. There was a real push and pull in me about some of what he was saying. Yeah, it was really okay. I guess one question too, though, as you were talking, Daniel, to sort of play devil's advocate, is around, because you were talking about how finding these key principles, they need to be universally applicable. So why do they need to be universally applicable versus something more like local, responding to local contexts?
That's a great question. I almost would say instead of universally applicable, they're going to be universally present. Like what variables are going to be present in all possible circumstances.
What is the thing that ties us all together ultimately?
Yeah, and what will be present in all circumstances. Like, so for example, now there's going to be something like health, for example. Now, health in 500 years could look very different than health looks now, but there will be some sort of notion of what it means to be a living organism versus a dead organism. That's a very vague example, but likewise, there will be something like communication. Maybe it's telepathy, maybe it's a Neuralink, I don't know. It could have different qualities, but there will be something like communication that will be present. If there is going to be society, now maybe there's, everyone isolates and there is no society, there's just isolated individuals in little places in the forest or something, that's possible. But if you're talking in terms of a social order, which I think is really the challenge because we're dealing with pluralism. We have no idea how to hold pluralism together without anxiety destroying it and pulling people apart, looking for a return to some sort of sense of social coherence because everyone around them thinks similar. The problem of traditional belonging, therefore why we have to think belonging anew. So, if you're going to think the issue of global pluralism, you have to think, you're thinking the social, and then the question is, well, what do you think about the social that would have any bearing on the problem of global pluralism? And to me, it has to be a principle that would be at play in all possible worlds, which is just a kind of modal logic Leibniz sort of phrase. And the reason it would is because if not, it is susceptible to be overturned by a black swan. It is susceptible to be overturned by something not predicted, right? But if it is something that is universally present, then it has the potential of being anti-fragile. Not just fragile or robust. If it's robust, it's probably totalitarian. If it's fragile, then that means it will break down. It has to be anti-fragile. And almost by definition, whatever is anti-fragile has to be that of which is going to be present in some way in all possible circumstances of the entity in question. And the entity in question is the social, and there's always communication in the social. Therefore, we want to think about the principle that's going to be present in all possible circumstances because only that kind of principle could be anti-fragile. And only the anti-fragile principle would be the one that would be sustainable. Not because it is robust and totalitarian, but because it's improvisational. It has this ability to handle whatever arises that is not predictable. And that's kind of what I have in mind. And communication would certainly be that, because even when something unpredictable occurs, you will be talking about the unpredictable thing. There will be communication in the event that is unpredictable. So that's why I say that.
Mm. I do at some point want to, my mind is now thinking about fear and anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we do that, just being honest about what's going on in my head.
Yeah,
Before we do that, Seth, is anything coming up for you from that?
sure.
Well, to be honest, I'm trying to ground what we're talking about, because the first question was sort of like, what do we talk about? And if we talk about this, it goes this way. And if we talk about it, but why are we talking about this or that? So it just felt like I was trying to put some things together, but there's a lot of interesting ideas that came out just now. I mean, part of what comes to mind is like, you know, my YouTube like suggestions of which videos I should watch next, you know, it's got a lot of AI, this and that in it, and probably other people get more of that, but maybe some people get less of it. But I'm just getting all of these things about, I think there was some viral video about 2027, or I'm seeing things about 2030, but like the timeline for radically unrecognizable reality, at least is being presented as being closer and closer. And the reason I talk about my YouTube feed versus someone else's is like, honestly, I don't know if other people, or I'm sure other people are getting the message like me, but maybe some people aren't thinking that at all. They're just thinking it's another day in the neighborhood. But however accurate any of these, you know, predictions are, I do feel like you mentioned a black swan. Like, I keep imagining black swan, you know, not because I have any insider knowledge, but it just seems like that's what's in the air.
Yes.
Or, you know, in the news, I mean, like, you know, the big thing in the news, of course, is this scandal around Jeffrey Epstein and Trump and everything. But the very nature of it is like about revealing information. And then, of course, you know, the people who don't like Trump are like getting ready to like watch him go down. And so you start seeing photos of Trump with Epstein and stuff. And then some of these pictures are AI. Like, so there might be a real thing going on, but it's already like there's two sides, you know, there's opponents in this particular thing that's happening. And it's like, no one's playing clean anymore. And like, I feel like I'm actually am watching reality kind of get blurrier.
Yes.
And so what interested me about what you were saying, Daniel, around communication, the idea that who knows, maybe one day it'll be telepathy or Neuralink, but what are the things that will remain the same? I do think that's an interesting, you know, thing to think about. I mean, when we talk about authentic resonance, that phrase seems to have this ring to it, like we're talking about a principle that you know, it might be malleable, it might show up in different ways, but there's a thing that we can always look for. And I can see how looking for smaller and smaller, like I'm thinking of all of these startups that like Uber and things like this that totally changed the world very quick, or even back in the day, Airbnb, you know, like you had hotels and then suddenly, but all those things revolved around people's phones because everyone had a phone in their pocket. And that was like that small little thing that was true of everyone. So I'm interested in this idea of like, what is the everyday thing that no matter how radical the change is,
yes,
would actually be there on the other side of some kind of singularity or whatever, because more and more for myself, just for my own psychological state, I actually feel relieved often by the thought, stop trying to predict, there's no way you can do it. Just go with the flow, because what else are you gonna do? Like that kind of makes sense to me just in my everyday life more and more as I watch what's happening. But anyway, I was trying to figure out where's the sort of the thread that we're working with here.
Well, I think that's right on it because to me, you have to think about now things to focus on that will apply in all possible worlds because the world next is completely unpredictable. So you need to do that, which is going to be present in all possible worlds, like communication. I think, and I actually think it's strongly tied to the issue of anxiety because anxiety, and it would be very good to speak on what exactly anxiety is. I tie anxiety to a certain groundlessness, to a certain sort of nothing is given. It's not just fear, it's a certain sort of I don't even know the frame by which to interpret right from wrong. It's not merely what is right and what's wrong. It's tied to the question of what is even the proper framework of asking the question what is right and wrong. And how do I even feel like my framework is solid enough to trust my intuitions, right? Like not only do I question my interpretation, I question if I even have a frame that is valid by which to interpret, right? Well, that's very much tied to the AI because if AI is going to basically make it radically unclear what is reality, like where you don't even tell, you're going to be, I think anxiety strongly describes the coming feeling. And the loss of societal givens is the beginning of that unleashing of anxiety that AI and deepfakes completes. Like and global pluralism is a trajectory of anxiety. And of course, the great move in psychoanalysis is to claim that freedom is anxiety. Like you don't have freedom where you don't have anxiety, because if you don't have anxiety, that means you're locked in a framework, right? Well, if the world is going to be increasingly defined by a certain sort of unreality, a certain sort of anxiety, then focusing on the things that are going to be present in all possible worlds is really the only way to be prepared for the future, not predict the future. You can't predict the future, that's a fool's errand, but you can be prepared for it. Well, what is something, and that's what I've become very interested in, what are things that are going to be present regardless what the future is? Well, I would think conversation would be present regardless what the future is. I would think authentic resonance, a form of that, will be present regardless. The gestalt would be present regardless. The difference between fear and wisdom will matter in the world regardless. And when you're thinking about those principles, that's a way where you can then do something today that is not going to be washed away by the unpredictability of what comes next. That is nevertheless not trying to predict the future, but be able to receive it. And I think basically, interesting enough, skills like the skill to communicate, which people will be like, well, that's not going to get you a job. What is that exactly going to do? Well, a lot of the things that were going to get you a job are going to be replaced by AI. You'll have this great inversion where things like actually doing body work or actually understanding the difference between thinking and perceiving, these become radically important skills because the principles of those distinctions will matter in all possible worlds. In all possible worlds, which again, another way to think of the phrase all possible worlds is I'm not really thinking multi-dimensions. I'm thinking multiple, whatever future may come about, right? So to talk about all possible worlds is to talk about an unpredictable future. So what can you do today that will apply in all possible futures? Well, communication. And so whatever we need to think today is probably going to be about one of those principles because that's going to be in play regardless what AI does. And I actually think thinking such principles, I actually think it goes a long way to helping one fight anxiety or not be overwhelmed by anxiety because you feel like you have something stable. I don't know if there will be lawyers tomorrow, but I know that friendship will matter. I know that communication will matter, and I know authentic resonance will matter, and that actually gives you a certain stability, a certain sort of confidence. But I do think this topic, it is very much tied to the question of anxiety and what is anxiety. I think of those things together. So those were just some thoughts.
Yeah, I think the distinction between fighting against or sort of being overwhelmed by anxiety is important because of my estimation anyway, there's a level of anxiety that is good, that doesn't impede our ability, I guess, to continue to communicate, to be authentically resonating, to be moving, to have momentum in life. And so but then there is anxiety that is overwhelming, that floods us and that leads to all sorts of, or just suffering from like just the physiological suffering of that, but also has all sorts of cognitive effects. It actually deludes us. It actually distorts our perception. And it can have this sort of reinforcing loop to it in that it distorts the person whom we're communicating with to become someone who is extra anxiety provoking, which further it keeps us over threshold. And there's I think the nuance around anxiety is lost. And, that is part of what has been useful about the way that I work, is actually distinguishing different forms of anxiety, and working with them very differently. And it's moment to moment as well. I think that's the other important thing, is that the anxiety that you experience in any given moment can be an indication of something that is occurring in that very moment. People often, I think, confuse it with, well, it's because I had, some interaction yesterday, and so I'm feeling anxious about it today. We can dig into that. There is something to that, but there's often the case that it's actually giving you information about the very moment. And so the idea of trying to get rid of anxiety, I think, is foolish. But it's understanding what is the frame of anxiety that is still useful, can still be useful, we can still work with, and that by tuning into, it might tell us something, and then what is going over threshold where it actually does get in the way, and we can learn ways to deal with that in order to get back into, the window of tolerance, or whatever you want to call it. But in saying that, what did I just say? So there's the stuff so the other thing too, I think, is communication is going to be emotionally evocative, because the other place that my mind goes to is we're thinking about what is the thing that will probably remain. I mean, I guess you can make a case for there might be some manner in which emotions get wiped out of existence, but I think emotional tone and emotional experience, to some degree, is pretty it's a pretty fundamental part of being human. And so within communication, you are constantly being emotionally triggered as well. Like, I use the word triggered lightly there. I just mean emotions are being evoked. And it's very fast. And I think our ability to be able to tolerate those mixed emotional states, and that really what it gets to the heart of here, I think, is that the way I work, at least, is that not all anxiety, but a large chunk of anxiety is a signal that something that is happening right here in this very moment is evoking some kind of conflictual state inside it. And it depends on our ability to be able to hold mixed states. We call them states. I mean, I'm using words in a not very precise manner, right? But just mixed feelings, right? And noticing I like what he's saying and I don't like what he's saying at the same time, as a simple version of that. Noticing I want to do that, and I also, something in me doesn't want to do that, right? Like noticing the tension, the conflict, our ability to be able to notice that that's even happening. And first of all, to notice that that's happening, we have to be able to see under the noise of the anxiety. And so that's going to depend where our anxiety sits. And there's, a certain level of anxiety that I think we can read as, oh, that's what's happening. And if I just continue to investigate further, then I can experience the emotions. And then there's anxiety that goes beyond that, that starts to do the distorting thing, or the extra level of self-suffering thing, which is unhelpful, because that is necessarily, I think, in some cases it doesn't, but I think necessarily that is going to get in the way of us being able to connect. That will form its own disconnection. And then there is, so once we can do all that, then there is also just learning to be able to be with more than one thing at once. So like, what we talked about a million times before, but just broadening the scope of a person's ability to be able to hold things that are not simplistic. And I don't mean to imply too much that word. I just mean that are one or the other, or like really helping people to build their repertoire of what it is that they're able to hold all at once, and how they make sense of that and understand that. And then there's a million other pieces that go with that as well. But if we're talking about communication, then I think a fundamental piece of that is also, as you say, the role of anxiety, but also that's linked to, in a large part, especially in relationship, coming up against emotions within ourselves, often mixed emotions, conflictual motivation systems, all these things. Let me see if I've got anything else written here. I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there for now.
Well, I was also thinking about this idea of tolerating anxiety, as opposed to sort of, I mean, there's situations where it is reasonable to talk about reducing anxiety. Maybe there's anxiety that is unnecessary, right? And when I clarify something about my situation, I can actually, beautifully, magically melt some of that anxiety away. But I think the idea of actually eliminating anxiety is not a good idea at this point, just because I don't think it's really possible. I mean, of course, I'm always amazed when I have a nice weekend and get out of the city and, you go somewhere very quiet and then you go, oh, this is what quiet is. I thought quiet was, like just before bedtime last night, but now that I'm out in the country or whatever, Daniel probably has a nicer experience of that more often than I do. But there's so much, again, I'm speaking as a city person, but I imagine a lot of people listening to this might be as well. But what we forget is normal is relative to what we're used to, right? And, in my day today, I had an interaction with someone who was very anxious and, had a lot of, let's say, pre-composed stories about what the interaction was going to be and all of that. Now, I sort of anticipated this, right? And I felt pretty calm and pretty good before the interaction. I was thinking about what was going to happen. And afterwards, I was pretty happy that I still seem pretty, but during the interaction, I noticed my heart beating faster. And I know a lot of things because the other person was very dysregulated. And it just occurred to me, well, I'm glad that I anticipated that. And even though my heartbeat was, sped up and I was needing to I was hearing things I wanted to argue with and simultaneously thinking arguing won't help, and all of that. But it's as if I didn't consider the situation somehow extraordinary. I was expecting that to be what it was. It was a certain time bound. I knew it wasn't going to, go on for hours and hours. It was going to go on for about an hour, and I had that situation. I went through it, but it's been occurring to me recently just that various kinds of discomfort. To me, one of the most useful things I can do with discomfort is get curious about it.
Yes.
And some of it really might be beyond my control. I'm just uncomfortable because whatever something's going on in my neighborhood, and it's kind of anxiety provoking. But I expect more and more of that in our lives. And in terms of on the theme of communication. There are some of us who are, thinking about the internet as a social coordinating mechanism and coming together in places like VoiceCraft or the net, and, these conversations. But I do think that there are also a number of people who are going more and more into just interacting with the screen, or, so I think there's a broad spectrum of realities, and there's a broad spectrum of, how people are communicating or how people are seeing the world. So even if I feel incredibly grounded, I still don't know what I'm going to encounter when I walk out the door. And I think that's more and more the case. So I do think there's just something really useful about, I know that at an earlier point in my own life, I probably did have some ideas about, I'm gonna, maybe if I do martial arts or if I take enough workshops, like some version of I'm gonna reach that perfectly Zen place, or I'm gonna, I'm gonna make it financially and I'm gonna have a really nice place to live and that'll make everything okay. At this point, if I try to imagine my best future, it always has to do with being more and more skillful, but also less and less attached to, things being the way they are today, again, tomorrow. So I guess I'll leave it there. But I think that's more, I guess what I'm trying to say is just like even our concept of what it would mean to live the good life, whatever was the good life 10, 20, 30 years ago, it's not going to be the good life 10, 20, 30 years from now for whomever is able to say I'm living the good life. It's going to be very different dynamic.
Yeah, and I think this range of anxiety that I'm talking about, that like you're saying, Seth, you can't really imagine living life without some anxiety. To me, I see that as the anxiety that signals I'm on the edge of what I know here currently. Right? It's an invitation, it's an opportunity, it's that. So, and it does come with an anxiety. It's like a charge. It comes with because it's letting me know that. And I think in a way, if you can meet it like that, like it's the signal that lets you know, right here is an opportunity to go beyond what you consciously know right now. Now, in this moment, it might be very inconvenient to stop and try and do that, right? It just might not. I just can't because I'm, in the middle of, looking after my children and also cooking and whatever's going on, or you might just be in crisis in your life, whatever's going on. And so you might not meet it in that moment. You might not choose to try and, do something with it. And then, it's uncomfortable and it's an annoyance because it's inconvenient in that moment to notice that you're on the edge of what you know, and it's inviting you right in that moment to open up in a new way and potentially learn something new. So I think there is that kind of struggle against that anxiety, which is worth mentioning too. It doesn't mean that every time this version of anxiety shows up that it's easy to embrace it as some wonderful invitation to learn something new about yourself. But I see that as what that is. There's a little doorway there. It's letting you know something. And even if you're able to just sort of tag it for yourself and come back to it at some point.
Yeah.
I do a lot of that, just noticing the things that unexpectedly create all this sort of what I call like striated anxiety. The body, I just notice, I'm like, wow, that was unexpected. So I think about what was happening there, and I can't deal with that now, but maybe later I can work on figuring out what that was about.
Yeah, just to add one thing, what you said, you used the word tag. I tag it, and I think that's a nice concise way to get to the difference I was trying to say. Is I might have a very uncomfortable feeling, and I might even have a story that it's here because I'm in this interaction, or because of what happened yesterday, or because of the state of something in my family, whatever it is. But for myself, I find that it's more and more functional to resist tagging that feeling as if it shouldn't be here.
Yes.
So I might feel hot, I might feel tense, but it's more like, can I just adjust the dials to know that this is a hot, tense situation? And then within that, the fact that I'm hot or I'm tense, just as examples, does not mean that there is anything wrong here.
Right.
Of course, if I pass on to the next situation that feels cooler and calmer, of course, I will be happy to have arrived in that other zone. But there's because the thing about this isn't how it should be, that always takes my attention to how do I get out of this situation? It always takes presence elsewhere. So can I remain present while I'm very aware of discomfort? I'm very aware that I don't like the feeling, but I don't label the feeling as wrong in any sense.
Yeah, and I think though that's right. That's the confusion that gets made, because that is really, you think about the sort of primal nature of anxiety. I think that is really what it is, maybe potentially at first designed to do, is to help. Oh, quick, get out of the situation. This is like warning bells. But instead, yes, and I know what you're meaning about the tagging it. I think that's important. Sometimes the mistake I see, from my point of view, that can get made though is almost going too far the other way, which is I simply meet it in the moment for what it is, which is like, this certain level of discomfort in my body, and then sort of proceed. And then I guess what I'm suggesting is that there is a pattern as well. So it's like two layers. It's that is important. But then there is, if you're interested over time, being able to sort of notice the pattern of what are these different situations where I get that kind of anxiety, right? And that's sort of what I mean by tagging. I don't mean tag it as in I'm trying to pretend I can file it away and not feel it in that moment. It's still there. It's still there. It's more like I guess because of what I do for work, I tag it because then I'm interested in understanding when I have the time. I also understand what is the pattern that this is revealing to me, and this is how I continue to learn so much more about myself, and this is how I grow, which can sound very self-indulgent when I say it like that, but because, you know, even recently I've been noticing different patterns, like a brand new sort of pattern of how this shows up for me. So even after sort of years and years of doing this stuff, new things are still revealed. And as I do that, there's just so much more is opened up to me in life, and so much more possibilities opened up to me in existing relationships, new relationships. My physiology can change as a result. I can notice that the level of anxiety that I experience in those sorts of situations diminishes, doesn't go away. I'm not trying to imply that it goes away. So I think it's important that it's an invitation to, there's an opportunity for both things. To meet it in the moment for what it is, to not be scared of it and read it as a sign of like something's wrong. I think that's vitally important. It's more like an invitation that something's happening inside me here, that is generating this anxiety, right? And it's either that, you know, if we go back to sort of fear, it's either that there really is some kind of physical threat coming at me, which, right, would be more like fear, or it could be often the case that the anxiety is being generated by some internal conflict that is rising within me, that is starting to go past the bounds of what is usually unconscious and spring up into consciousness. I'm starting to become aware of something inside me that usually I'm able to keep the lid on, is one way of thinking about it. So there is an invitation to do that. Now, I don't want to suggest that most people in their day-to-day life are able to stop when that happens every time and do some exercise and do all that. That's not what I'm suggesting. I think, Seth, you're beautifully coming in a much more practical way, whereas I'm talking more of like, you know, ideal world, if you could stop and, I don't know, do some therapy on yourself in every moment. But I think it can be useful for some people, depending on where you're at, to be aware of that idea of it. That it might be one way that helps them to reorient to that kind of anxiety as not being something that is wrong, but actually more like oh, wow, if you can approach it that way. Oh, wow, there's something new inside me that's ready to break through and if I want. It is an invitation. I still don't like the signal, particularly that requires me to notice that. I don't like it. I don't like, you know, joining a Zoom call and I'm feeling fine, and the second faces pop up on the screen, I'm like, oh, why is this all starting up now, you know, in my body? No, it's not, you know, it's not enjoyable. Yeah. But it can just help you to reorient to it, to understand why it might be happening, and that actually inside it is the opportunity to open up to new possibility. Oh, there's so much I could say on that, but I'll hold it and see what you both have to say.
Well, I think everything that everyone is saying is extremely important, and I think this idea of anxiety pointing basically to higher dimensionality is really important. There is something about anxiety that is basically the suggestion that you are encountering something that you don't have, I almost want to say, the capacity for, but you get to decide if that means you can't get the capacity, or is this an invitation to gain the capacity? Like, there's something about, well, we've talked about algebra versus geometry. I associate anxiety with basically an encounter in the algebraic that suggests that algebra is not the case, that you need higher geometry. So let's just take the example, you have an experience where you're both happy and sad at the same time. In algebra, that's not possible. So if you encounter that, it either means this isn't actually happening, or you're misidentifying, it's just happy or it's just sad and you're confused. Or what if actually reality is geometrical, which it is very possible in geometry to be happy and sad at the same time, right? So you get to decide, right? And so like the idea of describing something as happy or sad, that's really hard to think. But experiencing happy and sad at the same time is easy, right? Experience is geometrical, thought is more algebraic. And anxiety occurs in the break between experience and thought, or thinking and perception. Like it occurs in those moments where you have to think about something that goes beyond thought as naturally presented. And it's actually lending itself more into the experiential. And anxiety is the evidence that the experience is more real than the thought, that the geometry is more real than the algebra. Well, that means you have to, it's an invitation then to think about thinking and actually to, well, change what you think thinking is doing. Thinking is not about Seth, when he was talking about this adjustment of dials versus right or wrong, I think this is absolutely more of what thought is. Thought is more about some sort of conditioning and adjustment of the subject to reality to change how it is experienced than it is the determination of right and wrong. Right? Right and wrong is the language of arithmetic and algebra. 2 plus 2 equals 5, wrong. 2 plus 2 equals 4, right. Right and wrong is more of lower dimensionality. Higher dimensionality is more of an adjustment of dials. It is more of a, okay, this is the pain I'm feeling. Well, that's a signal that I need to change my body. Oh, this is what I'm feeling, then I need to adjust. That's a language of geometry because you're changing your directionality. You're changing how you are approaching the phenomenon. And the issue is, if your experience of anxiety means I shouldn't be feeling anxiety, you are locking yourself into algebra. You're locking yourself into lower dimensionality, right? The problem is we don't have a society that has been able to explain to people how anxiety is useful. That question hasn't been there. And this is a really actually major problem because if people don't see a certain freedom in anxiety, a certain potential for growth, then they will naturally interpret anxiety as that which I need to get rid of. And there are many ways that you can get rid of anxiety that many people are now doing. You can find a community where everyone is like you. You can return to racism. You can return to nationalism. You can return to traditional forms of belonging where you get a social coherence and a coherence with reality and anxiety goes away. And if it doesn't occur to you that no, anxiety is actually the necessary invitation for a society that's able to actually handle difference versus get rid of otherness, then you will interpret anxiety as evidence that the modern world made a mistake and we need to go to the pre-modern or we need to go back. And that is going to be taking you to, well, forms of society that are problematic and immoral. But why would, if no one ever made you think that anxiety has a role, why would you not go in that direction? Or getting rid of the people causing you anxiety, or saying they're the problem, or they're the bad guy, or I should avoid them. It really does matter how we interpret anxiety. It will have economic, political, social, marital, friend consequences big time. I think all, please.
I just want to throw on, I think another one, not everyone, just some. Another one going about that, I think, can be also seeking a diagnosis in some situations.
Yes.
Kind of this, right? It's a way to get the rubber stamp that this is just how I am. I cannot change, right? And yeah.
Well, that makes me think Edie, she has a lovely paper and she works as a clinician and she talks about the problem of thinking that naming the effect is the same as curing the effect, like naming or diagnosis. And there's actually this idea that in some forms of development, understanding and naming are actually an obstacle. When you understand what's going on, you stop developing. Well, if understanding can hurt development, then thinking can be a threat to development. And this is where actually, as I talk with Seth, and I think about a lot, thinking is supposed to serve perception, not perception serve thinking. Thinking is supposed to serve experience. It's supposed to, because if you don't do that, then you're going to end up in algebra. The only way to be in geometry, per se, is to have thinking serve experience. That's meaning you actually put understanding on the back burner from the unfolding of the experience. You don't let understanding and naming and diagnosis get in the way of the experience, which also makes sense in the sense that whatever naming or understanding you have is necessarily going to be based on the paradigm that you're from or you're in. And if what's coming is new, by definition, your understanding will have to cut it off, right? Because however you understand it must be according to what you understand. And if anxiety is leading you to something new, or if the world is going in a new direction, understanding can only get in the way. You need to get better of being almost the Cézanne painter, paying attention, really watching it, gaining the phenomenology of glimpses. And I know Based Camp, Robert, he has that lovely book where he's been talking about awareness as an ethical act, and I think that is correct. And I think basically, too, that ability to keep open the awareness is what anxiety, basically in my experience, I really like what Seth was saying about the adjustment of dials versus the right or wrong. Also, what he said that and I'll close and pass it to whoever wants to speak. And also things can be said about analogical reasoning, which I'm tempted to go into, but I will resist. Probably not for long, but I'll resist for now. Is that when you said that basically we need to be less attached and more skillful with the future. Yes, that's it. That like the future, like this moment calls for greater skillfulness and less attachment to certain images of the future. I get like you need to be more skillful. And for me, when I'm saying this whole thing about a principle that's possible and that's what principle is going to apply in all possible worlds, that is a question of determining what skills to focus on. Like, what are the skills you should focus on, and how should you become more skillful, right? But the point idea that a world that you can't predict is one that you need to be more skillful regarding and less attached regarding. Exactly. And I would argue that these skills are primarily in the terms of the social relational skills. Relational skills are basically going to be central for the possibility of making the social prepared for a future you cannot predict. They're going to be relational skills. And absolutely emotions are part of that. I don't think there's such thing as thinking without emotion. I don't think it exists, actually. I think this whole idea of getting rid of emotion, well, no one would say, can we get rid of thought? Well, oh, you mean like Neuralink? No, I mean get rid of thought entirely. We'd be like, well, we don't want that. We'd be dead, right? Like the idea of getting rid of thought entirely would be ridiculous to us. But when we say get rid of emotion, we go, oh, well, that's possible. I can see that. No, emotion and thought are like the same activity, actually.
You wouldn't think.
No, you would not think. There's a paper in The Map is Indestructible that says the myth of the heart-mind split, that there's heart and mind. No, they're two sides of the same phenomenon. Like there's no split at all. So getting rid of emotion would be getting rid of everything. So getting good in emotion is absolutely going to be important. But that idea of the skillfulness, one of those key skills is the ability to, in a situation, instead of saying, this is wrong, I shouldn't feel this way, you instead adjust. You adjust the dials, is what you were saying. 1,000%. Anxiety, I think, is an invitation to basically realize that. Like anxiety is the realization of that, because anxiety is that of which if you say, make the anxiety go away, you actually didn't address the anxiety. You just put it off. You postponed it because you still haven't developed the skills of anxiety. So I think a society that is basically feeling more and more anxiety is one that's kind of being forced into a sublation, forced into a change of thinking in terms of adjustment versus right or wrong. Like adjustment versus, because adjustment is geometrical. When you're adjusting, you're saying, I'm not going to see this situation as wrong because that's algebra. I say, I shouldn't feel this way, therefore this situation equals bad. When you adjust the dial, you're literally saying you can change your perspective on the situation. You can change how you approach it. Well, that's adding dimensions then. You can move around it. It's not just across an equal sign. You're moving around it. You see what I'm saying? So when you adjust the dials, you're saying that every situation can actually be approached in different ways. 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, as Wallace Stevens said in that poem, right? Well, that adds freedom to every situation then. Because if every situation you can adjust your dials relative, that means your response to the situation is not determined by the situation. You're not forced to say, that's wrong, or that's bad. That's kind of a reduction of freedom. If you can adjust the dials, that's an increase of freedom, actually. And in that increase of freedom, you feel an increase of skillfulness. Because you actually feel like you can move around. You can change your relation to it. So there's an increase of skillfulness. Skill and freedom kind of go together. Because if you're not free, you don't really need skill. You just need a program. You just need the answer, right? When you're free, that's when you need skill. And that's when you need the skill of how to adjust in that freedom to rightly approach the situation. So I think on this idea of going in and being like, how do I adjust the dial versus just simply giving into the temptation to say it shouldn't be this way. That is habituating the human to actually be able to handle an AI world or an unpredictable world. Because if you don't give that ability, then when the world throws at you, I should be able to tell if this is real or not. Not being able to tell if it's a deep fake. I should be able to know what's true or false, right? That habit of identification, if you have that, then as you go into an unpredictable world and you can't tell what is the case, then you're going to be overwhelmed. But if you go, well, I don't know if it's real or false, or I don't know what the future is going to be, So I'm going to adjust. Instead of asking those questions, I'm going to ask, how does it make me feel? How does this help my relationships? What is this doing to my body? What is this doing to me? The thing could be real or false. You don't need to know that to know those questions, right? And to approach those questions in terms of the social and the relational, right? And that makes me think of Greg Dimber and his work on the literary theory metamodern. And I don't have to know what's true or false to know the emotional effect that I am having regarding this thing, right? So you're adjusting what you're looking for in experiences, and it is going to go in the direction of attention and emotion and how you're able to hold yourself in those situations. And basically, I think that is what anxiety is inviting you to consider. And if you simply say, and I'll stop here, if you simply say anxiety is bad, then you never consider those things, and therefore you will not be ready for what's coming, like in 2027 or the AI. Like anxiety is actually like the invitation to prepare for what's coming. There's actually a kind of grace in it. It's kind of a grace. It's like a warning sign. It's like a canary. It's like, hey, you need to start getting ready. You need to start moving your thinking to a higher kind of dimensionality, to be able to unfold with it, to go with it, to not need to clearly identify. You need to be able to roll with it, because reality, what's coming is a world where if you're not able to roll with it, you'll be overwhelmed. Like you'll just be taken out. So there's a grace in it. It's like Flannery O'Connor is like, there's always a kind of grace in violence that can wake you up to the divine in a certain way. So I think it is really important, to agree with both of you. It is extremely important to not interpret anxiety as a problem to get rid of. It's an invitation to evolve, I almost want to say. It's an invitation to it's an invitation to change how you view the human being. Like, we've misthought the human being. We've misthought what thinking is. We've misthought what we are actually supposed to do in relation and to understand our situations. We're supposed to put perception first, then thinking, experience first, then identification. And anxiety is an invitation to realize we've been doing that backwards, but it is possible to change. We just have to adjust the dials.
Yeah. In a way, I hear you saying everyone needs to become a philosopher. And I think I've heard you say on other occasions that not even that's what needs to happen, but that is what happens as givens disappear, yeah. Right? Is everyone finds themselves in a state of inquiry, whether they want to be or not, because things don't make sense. But one of the things that, so I feel like there's this assumption we're making in this conversation, which is that, like, if we say the thing to do is adjust the dials, the assumption would be that the person is aware that there's a series of dials in front of them that can be adjusted, right? And I mean, I think that is true for some people, and I suspect it's not for others. I mean, this is one of those moments where I really feel very cautious about thinking I even know what the pattern is out there. Sure. I know what the people in my community are like. I know, again, what my social media feed is like. I know what the people I see in daily life, not on the internet, is like to some degree. But, I'll read some wild news article about someone who has gone off of some deep end I couldn't even imagine going off of. I mean, but what I would hope, and I wonder anyway, if there is some trend that's just there, is that more and more people would enter, some confusing situation, and rather than it's a video game and how do I get to the next level, they would have a little sense of being the person watching the person playing the video game, like that sense of, in meditative traditions, it's the witness consciousness. But can I actually carry around the witness consciousness at all times? So I'm having a good day or I'm having a bad day, but there's this other version of me that's watching me and saying, oh, look, you're having a good day, or look, you're not having such a good day. And there is some small part of my personality that is reserved for being quote unquote objective on some level, that's watching me in third person. Is that something, I mean, I feel maybe just because of the kind of work that I do, that's something that I've cultivated for myself. And I could certainly notice that in certain situations I look back and I was like, oh, you You didn't have any of you lost the objectivity for that particular interaction, didn't you? But even the fact that I lost it is something that I'm noticing. So anyway, I don't know what kind of broad generalizations I could make about that, but I do think that this is one of the things, is that it's like, is something wrong in this situation, or is something wrong with how I'm looking at this situation? Some people might not get to the place of asking, is it how I'm looking at it? Mm-hmm. But my hope and I guess I have a suspicion that with the world changing the way it is, that would be a question that might just arise for more people. Something I was imagining is like, when people talk about what is always going to be necessary, one of the things that comes up is knowing how to grow food. And when I hear that, I'm always very aware that I don't know how to grow food, right? But if I imagine, so I visit Daniel and he's got the garden, and I think, oh, well, if I was to hang out, in Lynchburg for a while, maybe I could learn something. But
we'll just run to Daniel. Don't worry. When the world ends, we'll just run to Daniel.
We'll just run to Daniel's house. But that's the thing, is like, you can imagine a situation where two people via circumstances find themselves in a problem-solving situation together. And let's say they're very intelligent, competent people, but their competencies are completely different. You have some kind of engineer kind of a person, and then you have, someone who does work more like what Aspasia does, who has a read on people. If at a certain point there's a task that involves two people, and one is going to need the help of the other, maybe there's a moment where the realization is, well, it's not that you're incapable, but you just don't have the background. And what is just my fluent language, I'm going to have to slow down and talk to you the way, they talked to me in the first year of my training, or, whatever it was.
This sounds like my marriage. My husband's an aeronautical engineer. Yeah, so if he's trying to explain how to do something practically, I can see just how frustrating it is for him to really slow down and explain it, because it comes so naturally to him. Yeah.
And that frustration is an inevitable part of trying to explain to you, who doesn't have, his background knowledge, what to do. But I think that's the kind of situation that, how I tie that together with this idea of, are you observing yourself in the moments as if from the outside? Well, if you aren't doing that, but let's say you find yourself, maybe because of the way the world is unfolding, more and more in problem-solving situations where the person I need to collaborate with, it falls on me to actually teach them what I know.
Yep.
That's the situation that can't be avoided at a certain point. And then the other half of that is there's a way that I might notice, oh, you're actually doing your best. And I know that I'm doing my best, but it's still not working. So I don't feel like I can blame you. I don't think I can blame myself, but it's not working. And I think, coming back to what we've been talking about, that might be how I interpret certain anxiety signals as something is wrong here, not in the sense that we're saying something's fundamentally wrong, but something isn't fitting, something isn't working. We need to hit the reset button. But somehow there could be a situation where it doesn't occur to me that it's your fault or it's my fault. That, so I guess I'm just trying to, I'd love to have a more concrete example of that, but I'm trying to flesh out something that I wonder if it could sort of organically arise. And it's not just because we say, oh, well, that person did all their reading and did years of practice until they attained the level to act this way. I'm trying to imagine, how could this type of situation just occur and spread and create a shift in that way?
How could, when you say the it could arise, sorry, what are we referring to?
Just the situation that in and of it itself speaks to everyone present, to make that what Daniel was calling the switch from algebra to geometry, rather than, okay, thank God we have the the guy who knows geometry in the room and he can save the day or something. But it's like,
Everyone.
how do people spontaneously think that new thought? Now it's coming out. It's coming back to me, the story of the Plato's cave, and like,
Yep.
how do you get out, or does someone lead you out, or if no one leads you out, how do you get out on your own?
I think that's so, yeah, this is such a key question. And so, a very simplified way too, I think, of thinking about it is, I'm not sure that there's one particular thing that is going to meet every person in that room at that moment and do that. Because, so, one crude way we might be able to divide people up, right, is that there's sort of a set of people for whom they sort of are swimming in anxiety probably too often, if we put it in those terms. They have trouble regulating their anxiety. They are having a very difficult relationship to their anxiety as a result. They're sort of being pulled around by the physiological signals of the anxiety, and then also some of the what I would call defenses that they try to use to regulate their anxiety that actually makes their anxiety worse. So worrying, rumination. I mean, this can be things like paranoia and projective processes, and this is actually increasing so they're really at war with their anxiety, right? There's sort of that, and so I do think for that set of people, something like helping them to become aware that there is this type of more mindful position they can take. There is a sort of wise observer, or like there's a million and one ways to talk about it. Essentially helping them to cognize more and to sort of take a more mindful step back position, the noticing, the right put it. That can be really useful. But the trouble that you run into is that there are a group of people for whom they might report not really experiencing anxiety ever, really, rarely anyway. And that's because they have these defenses that they operate so well to keep the anxiety not occurring. And these are often, again, very crude, can often be a set of defenses that look like hypercognizing, right? They are doing this thing. I know it's not exactly the same, but they're doing something that looks like this kind of noticing, curious, observing position. They are doing that all the time. There's a distancing quality to it. It keeps them so distant from their emotional reality that none of those conflictual emotions ever rise to the point of breaking through to consciousness. Therefore, no anxiety is triggered, right? So that's sort of the way that I would conceptualize it from my form of therapy. So the anxiety is triggered when the conflictual emotions start to break through into conscious awareness, the ones that are normally held down. And then we could talk about the different levels of anxiety. And then there are defenses that sit on top of that work to try to defend against the anxiety that's triggered by the feelings breaking through. So I think whenever this point comes up, there is some resistance inside me. Not in a, I guess it's just, I'm at pains to point out that I still think there are a group of people that do some version of that too much already. That's actually keeping them distant from their emotional reality. And so for those people, I guess, if I get to the point, it might be something more like helping them to actually completely let go of all that. But it's different to saying sort of doing it in a way where you're like observing kind of what happens or being curious. That's where actually a bit more pressure, I think, is required. Real pressure to just allow an emotional process that is beginning to unfold in your body to just come to fruition and break through and be expressed, right? So that's as opposed to what I think sometimes people hear as sounding a bit like going into more of an observing position. Does this make sense?
Right. That could just turn into a detachment or a permanent. I can always press pause and just come back to it later. And there's a way that you have to be careful there.
Yes, and also if a person is already doing that so much so that they are really not that in contact with their emotions anyway, then what they are starting to pay attention to and observe is completely removed from that anyway. Like it's this, they are living in this cutoff, this particular fabrication of themselves. I don't really know how to put it into words better. They are not really aware. So for example, they might be reflecting on an argument they had with their wife the day before or something. And they're not going to have any access, if this is kind of how they're structured, they're really not going to have any easy access in that reflective moment to their emotions that were the emotional conflict that was occurring within them. They would be probably more likely to just sort of go over the facts of what happened, maybe in a worrying, ruminative way. They might be noticing the conflict that's actually happening within them as something that's happening within their partner. And like there's a million ways it can go without taking up too much time, but it's detached. And I think really, from my point of view, the helpful thing to do with that person is to help them get into the emotion, allow the emotion to actually emerge through them, as opposed to engaging further in cognizing. And sometimes when we talk about being curious, I think people can go to that as a cognitive, I know these are sort of false distinctions, but more of a cognitive distanced curiosity about themselves. And it's quite often the case that they will just say, I don't really feel anything. I'm a bit annoyed that she was doing that, or, but I can tell she was feeling lots of things towards me. And then there's lots of focus on imagining what the other person was feeling towards them. So that's all. I just think, for me, it's very hard to imagine something. And maybe this goes back to the initial question that I brought up about designing systems. Not really what I was meaning, but it probably comes back to that point, trying to imagine exactly where we've come to now. Like, what would be the kind of thing that would allow any sort of like a group of people to have some kind of, I guess, experience of this geometry, if we put it in those terms. And for me, the difficulty is that I'm not sure that there's something, because people can be at such different places with how they're currently dealing with their anxiety. We just put it in simple terms, anxiety. It's a bit deeper than that. Yeah, is that helpful at all? If I just muddy waters?
You're not muddying the waters at all. I think what you was I think basically we have mostly used thought to avoid being human. And the only way to be human is through anxiety. Because anxiety is the maturing process. Because anxiety is the experience that there is a world that is real beyond you. Like, that you cannot bring into your structure. Like, anxiety is a radical encounter of otherness. Like, this thing is real and it's not me. Like, we all claim, oh, if I were to say to you, hey, how do you know the world, the external world is real? We all laugh and say, I don't, but haha, we all know. But practically, we actually naturally act like the external world doesn't exist. And we do everything in our power to actually make it practically non-existent. Even if technically it exists independent of us, we do everything in our power to make it practically non-existent. And anxiety is the experience of failure in that regard, where your efforts to practically make the external world not exist are failing, and it is there, and you have to account for it. And the choice is the following: change, begin taking otherness seriously, and complexity that is beyond your ability to flatten, complexity you have to unfold with, or figure out a new strategy to get rid of that thing. And there are different ways to do it. Like you said, people will cognize, objectify, use thought to not feel anxiety. One wonders if which world is worse. A world where nobody feels anxiety because they have the cognitive skills and, they've used their brain to avoid anxiety, or the world where everyone is anxious. Which is worse? It's not actually clear to me. The world where everyone is anxious might actually be better. In the sense of, Kierkegaard had that lovely line, where he said, the man who is in despair doesn't know they're in despair. That's worse than being in despair and knowing it. Because if you know you're in despair, then there's hope. If you don't know you're in despair, there's no hope. And I sometimes wonder that, where this world today where everyone seems anxious, that might be in a better place than the worlds in the past where no one was anxious, right? Precisely because that could have been the fruit of an operation to avoid our humanity. There is a sense where perhaps we now have an opportunity to be human for the first time. But the road is quite difficult. It requires coming to terms with radical otherness, and actually trying to integrate with the otherness as opposed to somehow distance ourselves from it. I think what you're saying, like for me, for situations like you're saying, there is something about this idea of looking at it. I think of it in terms of shape. I like to spin it around. Like, okay, here's the situation. Let's spin it. Let's look at it from the top. Let's look at it. Let's turn it around. Let's look at it from their point of view, my point of view. Let's look at it from the bottom up. Let's look at it in terms of literature, now in terms of history. Let's look at it in terms of math. Like, to add multidimensionality, I think, is really critically important. Like when you go into a situation and you say, okay, my natural tendency is to experience everything according to algebra. So let me pause and make sure I'm understanding this in terms of geometry, which is to say I understand it in terms of all the dimensions, not just the equal sign. Because we all naturally interpret everything according to an equal sign, which is algebra. And the equal sign is this. It equals good, it equals bad. Done. But that's what you want to resist. You want to say, no, let me bring in history. Let me bring in literature. Let me bring in their point of view. Let me bring in emotion. Let me turn it around. Let me look at that. I think is critically important, because if you don't do that, you're not habituating your brain actually into movement and time and geometry. You're letting it give into the habits of, I know, I'm the judge. I know the truth. I have the truth. I have understanding. I can name it. Well, here's the issue. Once you name it, you can't treat the effect, as Edie was saying. That's so important. You can't treat the symptom. You can't treat the situation because you don't allow it to unfold anymore. So I think that's very, very important. I think also to this question of how do you spread the condition. So there's a few things. There's the argument to be made that the more the world undergoes global pluralism, the more people will experience anxiety. And therefore, they will be forced over and over again to have the experience you can only adjust by changing your view of it into more of a dial mindset, a geometry, and it will just keep repeating, and either you'll change or not. And if you don't change, the consequences become more and more dire. And there's kind of a mechanism of self-correctness because it is global pluralism itself with technology that creates this anxiety. And if that is the very characteristic of society and people's jobs and the way they use the internet and so on and so forth, then you will simply have more and more anxiety that will not go away unless you change your relationship to the anxiety or medicate it away or get more and more intense neurotic strategies of closing yourself off to it. Like you're using thought aware. Well, I think we're seeing this. This is happening live. People are, unfortunately, choosing to go in the direction of solving anxiety away. And one of you see people going into fascism. You see people going to tribalism. People are separating from global pluralism. I am of the opinion, though, that none of those strategies are actually going to work, though, unless you actually truly disconnect from technology. This would be another argument. You cannot go back to belonging in the traditional way. This is a huge thrust of the book, is that people today are looking for belonging. Since we haven't thought to create the conditions of belonging again in different terms, people are going traditional ways. You cannot do that. You're really just returning to what I call an indestructible map. This is an entirely different subject. It looks like belonging, but it's ideological insulation that technology, you have to separate from technology. You literally will have to have a more Amish strategy. And Amish are not anti-technology. They vote on technology to create more isolation. Because if you don't have isolation, you'll have anxiety. And as you get anxiety, you lose belonging. And that leads to trouble, right? So we are seeing a world where the average person is feeling more anxiety and they are choosing how they respond to it. And many, many people are going in very problematic directions that are trying to avoid the anxiety by getting around people who are just Christian or just atheist or just whatever ethnicity or whatever, so that they share the same priors and don't feel the anxiety so much. Because here's the funny thing. When you are around people like you, then practically the external world goes away. That problem technically, there's an external world, and you can say, whoa. The reason you want to be around people like you is precisely so the world feels real. Oh, well, here's the tricky move. You define the world feeling real when you don't feel it, because anxiety is the feeling of the world. That's the great irony that's at play, is that people are literally, in the name of achieving reality, removing the feeling of otherness that confirms there's a reality outside their head. actually. And so people, when they go to be around people like them, they'll claim, finally, it feels real. It finally feels there. No, it's the removal of friction. It's actually a state in which you practically live as if the external world is not there, because no one can consequently upset your inner world because they're like you. That's what people are doing, and that's what more and more people will do. But if you don't want to see the world fracture off like that, then you have to interpret anxiety as an invitation to taking otherness seriously, which you're only going to be able to do if you are able to move to higher geometry. But there are many more things that could be said. But the problem is, thinking itself is anti-geometric. It is anti-dimensionality. It flattens. It wants to understand. So the only way to properly respond to anxiety is to have thinking fall behind perception. Have experience come first and then think. You have to change the order of which the entire modern world has been habituating us to have experience lead. How do you have experience lead, though, in a manner that doesn't make you end up in chaos? You have to learn emotion, you have to learn the body, you have to learn perception, you have to learn apprehension, you have to learn authentic resonance. You have to learn capacities that are able to give you intelligibility without understanding in the closing off way, right? This is an entirely different educational program. And basically what I would say is, yeah, it's an entirely different educational program. So if you're talking about spreading the conditions of the average person having this, it will have a lot to do with changing the school system. But here's the key move, and I believe we've talked about this before. It is not about changing the subjects of the education. It's the medium of the education as a medium. Like Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. We teach people in school that educated means you're good on tests and answering random trivia questions. We have to change the medium of education to associate education with conversation, with talking, with knowing, feeling your body, leaning into anxiety. Learning has to change the medium by which it occurs. And if you do that, then all you can do is increase the probability of the average person understanding anxiety correctly. You cannot guarantee it. You can increase the probability. Well, the likelihood of increasing the probability properly skyrockets if you change the medium of education that is habituating their mental associations of how they're to respond to anxiety. If education, and I'll stop here, if education makes you believe that the point of education is to solve problems away, to solve things away, to get rid of, to move on to the next grade, to move beyond things, then my natural disposition to anxiety will be to move beyond it. And if I do that by using thinking to close myself from it and never feel it, whatever works. If I do it by getting rid of otherness, whatever works. I've dealt with the problem. There are different ways to deal with the problem, but I've done it by making it go away. But if education instead is tearing with, orbiting, and always coming back and leaning into it, feeling it and having it pass through you entirely and entirely processing it and dwelling in it, if that's what it means to be educated, then to solve anxiety away would be to be uneducated and to fail the test, basically. People think they're passing the test to solve anxiety away. I'm passing the test. The test of anxiety is to make it go away, to pass it off. But really, anxiety is to pass through you. But that's not how we think about passing. Please.
I want to say right there that when I let go of the idea of making anxiety go away, that's a letting go. Because there's a part of me knows that I'm trying to do something that's impossible. And so when you say to me, there will always be anxiety, of course, those words don't sound like Disneyland, but there's a part of me that goes, oh, thank God, because I've been failing my whole life at eliminating anxiety. Like now we're actually talking about something that I could potentially get a handle on, because I know that I have days with less anxiety and days with more anxiety. But how many days can I remember where I eliminated anxiety? You know, it just feels like the target is so impossible. So yeah, I think there's something in that that's really important. When you started talking about changing the schools and you talked about all the different levels of training that would be necessary, I can also feel myself go, uh-oh, this is starting to feel like too much, you know, how do we do that? But I'm curious, because I think maybe I'm understanding what Aspasia was asking about when she said design systems at the beginning, because I mean, we've been talking, I don't know, what is eight or nine conversations about authentic resonance. There are themes that keep coming up here. And so there are potentially I don't know if it's a new set of givens, but there are patterns. And I think pattern is also an important word, because if there are less and less givens, if there are less and less common ground, there can be a sense that, I don't have ground to stand on. I'm not grounded. But when I'm looking at something that looks like pure chaos, and then I notice that something pops up every 3 seconds in the left-hand corner, then I start saying, oh, it's not pure chaos. There's a pattern here. And even though there's a lot of chaotic elements, that thing blinking in the left-hand corner of the screen starts to become an anchor for me. And so, yeah, anyway, maybe I'll pass it to Aspasia, but this is what I'm starting to just hear in the conversation. And I will say that I've been in conversation with a couple of other people around some of the themes that you and I talked about, Daniel, in terms of like, I do think that there are a number of people out there going, it's really strange how hard it can be to talk to another person who doesn't have the same starting point as me. And it's like, because I think that some people who get into the Nash equilibrium, who get into the impasse, it's not because someone in the conversation has malevolent intention. Like you can have two people with very good intentions who just get into a jam. So I imagine that others are asking this question, but it seems like we do need to start to, like in terms of anxiety, maybe a generalizable thing you could say that almost anyone would understand is just that anxiety can go a little higher and it can go a little lower. And rather than saying, well, I always want it to go down, maybe it's like, well, what is it like when anxiety goes down a little? What's it like when it goes up a little? How do I function with high anxiety? How do I function with low? Oh, different levels of anxiety are different opportunities, but just noticing almost from a neutral standpoint what a higher or lower level of anxiety feels like, and how I can operate well within those different. Anyway, let me pass it over to Aspasia, but I'm just beginning to say, oh, okay, maybe this is what you meant by systems.
But this is what I love, is I sort of had no idea what I meant either when I said it, and then almost immediately after I said it, I thought that's not really what I meant, and then and look, here we are. Look what now. So now we're figuring out what I was trying to say. See, this is, I feel the same way. I'm feeling the same thing inside. It's very clarifying. Okay, so so the experience first, and then thinking is so key here for me. Again, so the therapy approach I use, that is essentially what we're doing. That is kind of the different part of the difference of it. It really is experience first, just this kind of experience. And from that, when that's done in a particular way, from that actually lots of material arises for that makes the thinking part richer anyway. And actually, that thing you were talking about, Daniel, with the spinning, like spinning something around, and that just starts to happen really fluidly and spontaneously by the person themselves. It's almost like a lubricant or something that allows them to start to do the spinning around, and they do it on their own as well. I mean, there's some help from the therapist, of course, at times, but there's the experience first, and often that experience is the actual allowing, like I said, the emotional experience. If you really stop and pause right now, rather than all these million other things that your brain wants to do, your body wants to do, the anxiety is telling you to do right now, if you really just stop and pay attention, underneath that, something is trying to emerge inside you, right? And once they let the feeling up and they experience it, through that comes a lot of material that is relevant to what we might call the thinking process on the other side, that allows for this whole spinning thing to happen, and then allows a person often to see more possibilities before them, do the different perspective taking thing. And then, this ties into authentic resonance, and then sort of be equipped to determine out of all of those possibilities which they're going to go with, and to take action in the world. They're less paralyzed as a result. But I think for me, it's really key, and obviously not everywhere, but often it's really key that bit happens first. The experience thing happens first before the trying to do lots of the spinning and thinking.
Yes.
And that's where I get in the weeds of this sometimes when I talk to people, I think, because because there's something to the quality of what is available to our thinking mind, and yeah, the manner in which we have access to it, the sort of the freeing up of it. There is something about that that emerges from the, hold on, I feel it. And again, I want to be clear, it's a particular kind of anxiety. I'm not talking about all anxiety, but a particular kind of anxiety that we would call the green light, right? Continue to press and look at feelings. There's a particular form of anxiety that is almost an invitation to, oh, stop, because something's coming up. And if I can stop right now and not do anything more than really, this is something that people can often need assistance to know how to do and whatever. But if I can really just stop and you just try it yourself and let that feeling be birthed within me, then through that, and there'll be a wave of it, and it might not be a particularly comfortable feeling. But there's a wave to it, and often on the other side of that process, to varying different degrees, we are much better able to think in a way that is likely to lead us sort of geometrically, as opposed to algebra, right? To take us beyond ourselves, as we were, a few moments prior. So, and I want to be clear that there's different levels to that. I'm not talking about, like some huge unlocking where lots of unconscious material comes up necessarily. It might just be that, just some relevant, like the different pockets of relevant information suddenly arise together within me all at once in a way that I can, I see it now. A bit like what's happened here with the three of us. And then I said something at the start that I could sort of feel was trying to come up, and I didn't have the words. I didn't really know what I was asking. And I threw some words out. And now as the three of us talk, I'm getting much clearer. All these things are pinging at the same time. So, so the experience coming first is often really important. But to do that, we have to orient differently to particular kinds of anxiety and not see them as, all these things we've been talking about, things to be scared of or run away from, or whatever it is. There's also, though, I do want to be clear that there are other types of anxiety. So, like the ways within the frame of therapy I use, they distinguish three particular pathways. And so there is also, anxiety that goes beyond a point of being helpful to us that we would want to regulate. So if it goes into smooth muscles, if we're having, gastro issues, if we're going all floppy, if it goes into cognitive perceptual disruption, we're having ringing in our ears and we're getting tunnel vision and all these things, then these are signs often that we need to regulate. So I'm not trying to suggest that this is what you can do when you're absolutely flooded with anxiety. So it's important to learn all of those pieces. But my contention would be that the younger you can get in and help, if we can get this into like something about around these things into schools, the earlier you can get this in, the less likely I think you are to have developed over so many years these relationships that can be likely to lead you to higher and higher levels of anxiety too, that actually make it more difficult to be within the zone where you can do these sorts of things. And our whole relationship to anxiety in general, I think, could be reoriented that way as well. There's obviously a lot about how these patterns and systems are set up within us that is, relevant to our home life and early childhood and our parents and caregivers. But I still think that, places like schools have a really big role to play in being able to still help to shift and orient some of that. And that would be, I think, to a support to parents as well, like, to be having that happening in schools. The other piece that I wanted to highlight from something you said too, Daniel, it's probably not even following on, but just one little piece was, you're talking about the anxiety about being, when we come up against difference in the world, we come up against the other that is different, and the anxiety that comes up within us. The part of what I think why that happens is because it's also, again, drawing to our conscious awareness that also lives inside us. Like we try to flatten ourselves and present ourselves as being this kind of person who only has these sorts of feelings about these sorts of things, and I only treat people with compassion when they're experiencing X, Y, and Z, and only this and only that. And that makes me different from you, and you're bad because you feel other ways when those things happen to you. And what happens is when, it's in the contrast. So when we come up against someone who part of what happens with the friction of seeing difference is that it also pulls on the threads of the things that we have not yet brought up from our unconscious and integrated and understood as being also alive within us, and that we might be capable of those things too. And we may very well have lots of different feelings and impulses happen when we're in a situation where, I don't know, someone needs our time and attention and we're tired. There might be a lot that happens within us, not just, oh, I feel compassion and happiness that I can help you. As an example. It's a bad example. It'd be a better one. But it's there's sort of this mirroring component that goes on. And so the more that's why I think I've come to understand that focusing sort of intrapsychically is just as powerful. I guess I've been at odds for a while around, my area is really intrapsychic focus. And then I would come into conversations like these where people are talking about, interpersonal and like relationships and this whole, and almost in some circles, it's almost like, kind of denying that it's really that important to be looking inside, and it's much more about what goes on in groups and all these things. But actually now I can understand how one is really just mirroring and reflecting the other. And so when I talk about, noticing anxiety as a signal of conflict inside, yes, another way of talking about that would be anxiety as a signal of encountering difference out there, because it starts to stir the pot inside us of, oh, remember, I might have some of those feelings too, and I don't want to own those as mine, and this is threatening because they're starting to rise, and all these sorts of things. So, as we widen, and I guess it comes back to geometry, as we widen our ability to be with difference in others, we are widening our ability to be with the difference that lives inside us. And that is actually our shared humanity, is that we really are all encountering difference and conflict at every moment. And there's no escaping that. And there's a particular form of anxiety that is, I think, calling to us and reminding us that we are ignoring, we could be choosing in this moment to be ignoring some other kind of experience that is just burgeoning, ready to be brought up for us. We're ignoring a part of our experience. And again, I see it as an invitation. It doesn't mean you have to follow it. And you might not be able to follow it in that moment. I hope that ties up some of what I was saying. But I am also really curious about going into some discussion around, as an example, the schooling system, but just some of these more, like what is it? What is it exactly? What are some of the tweaks, even very small scale at the moment, that would be useful, and how we are helping to orient people to this differently?
There was a lot that was really important. Well, one, bring back oral testing over testing, and remove the monopoly on credentials that academia has, and open up different certification methods and more, and change intellectual property laws, and the structure of regulations that actually hurt entrepreneurship and actually reward joining large companies, and lowers the reward or the incentive to form culture or uses of free time that are actually engaging with other people to emerge to unpredictable results, because the regulatory structures of laws and so on and so forth make it basically overly onerous to even put those into practice. So there are actually, I think, so basically there's a difference between trying to build a system and creating a space. There's a difference between building a system and a program and creating a garden that you don't know the outcome of the garden, but you know that the elements are there that increase the probability of something growing. You can't predict necessarily what's going to grow and what's going to survive, but there's a very big difference between system and architecture that I have to elaborate on. And basically what we can do is create a medium condition, which is an architecture that doesn't require any outcome, but it incubates different habits in people that increase the probability of a different response to anxiety. Now, where that leads, you cannot predict, but you can create architectures and spaces that incubate different habits that increase the probability of a different response to anxiety that will lead to an unpredictable outcome. But here's the key. There is reason to think that the unpredictable outcomes of a world that responds to anxiety well are more desirable under unpredictable outcomes in a world that doesn't respond to anxiety well, and you get a different set of unpredictable outcomes. You can have reason to believe that sets of unpredictable outcomes are better or worse than other sets based on the variable that generates that set. So yes, we don't know the world that will arise from people responding to anxiety in a manner that see it as an opportunity to grow, but there is reason to think that that set of unpredictable outcomes is better than the set of unpredictable outcomes that happen when people view anxiety as a problem to solve away. Once you understand what anxiety is, and what is anxiety? It is the encounter of otherness. It is the encounter of an otherness that, and you brought up something very important, that brings out your own otherness to yourself, that you then have to confront, because that means anxiety is forcing you to address repression. And from history, we have good reason to think that repression is very unlikely to lead to outcomes that are desirable, right? It's not just an opinion. We have a historical record of that. Well, putting those things all together, there is reason to believe that an architecture that incubates habits of people who will respond to anxiety as something to face as opposed to running with will generate an unpredictable set of outcomes that is better than set Y, the other set, right? So that is kind of how you think about why. Like, what is the difference between a system totalitarian program versus a garden? And why does that distinction even matter, right? Because there are reasons to think that certain sets of unpredictable outcomes are better than others based on history and based on the reality of what anxiety is and based on anxiety occurs. And if you don't face it, you have to repress it. And we know what happens to people when they repress things, right? And also repression makes you fragile. And if the world is going to be unpredictable with AI, if people are repressed, the probability of being able to handle anxiety goes down, right? I'll slow down. There's a few things. When you encounter otherness, so this is very important. There's a lot of people saying that you need community, okay? That we can't be ourselves without community. The details of this are very important. If you are not careful, you will make everyone go to fascism, because everyone will be like, I will find communities of people like me who are like me, and we will form communities, and I can't be myself without other people. Community is the only way community can find the correct dialectic with the individual is communities of otherness, because the shock of difference, I'll talk about Leibniz with the logic of global brain. What ends up happening is when you encounter otherness, it draws things out of you you didn't know you had, and you become alien to yourself. And the only way to actually grow is to become alien to yourself, because until that point, you're like a doorknob that works, to take a Heideggerian example. It's invisible. You're actually invisible to yourself. The only way to actually, in a sense, become visible to yourself beyond your understanding of yourself. And what did we say earlier? Understanding gets in the way of development, right? So you have to get beyond your understanding of yourself to develop yourself. Well, that seems impossible, because by definition, however you think of yourself will fall within the parameters of your understanding of yourself. So how do you get around your own understanding of yourself to help you develop? By shocking yourself with yourself. How do you do that? It's only one way: in the presence of the other, who brings out something you didn't know was there. Now you have an experience of yourself, not a thought of yourself, an experience of yourself that you now have to come to terms with. And now think about. Now you have the material to think about. Until you have the encounter with other, you don't have the material from experience to think about, to know what you are. And then there's always the memory of, I thought I knew myself and it turned out I didn't. What if I'm doing that again and again and again and again? And so you ever need the encounter of otherness, right? It is extremely critical to emphasize the community we need to be ourselves is one of diversity, not a community of sameness. But here's the other problem. Too much diversity too quickly destroys us. Too much otherness too quickly overwhelms us. Too much anxiety too quickly we can't handle, right? So we have a developmental logic now. I like to associate it with Lovecraft, with the craft in parentheses between HP and Dante. It's a different subject, but we have to expose ourselves to otherness at a rate we can handle. Okay, how do you determine the rate you can handle if it can't fall within the parameters of understanding? It has to surprise you. Oh, so the rate that you can handle has to surprise you, and if you get it wrong, you're destroyed? That doesn't seem really good. That seems to be very problematic, right? That seems to be a contradiction. Well, yes, it's a major problem. But I am very certain that the earlier we start with people to develop the skills of being able to handle and approach otherness, the higher the probability it will be done at a rate they can handle. If you start this at 30 and you pick a random assortment of diversity or throw somebody into a college campus or somewhere, the likelihood of them being able to handle that diversity is low. But if you start it from, if you see this problem as the problem of global pluralism, as I'm alluding to it is, then you would say, we need to start on this ASAP. We need to be working on this as soon as possible, right? But you don't control where people live. You don't control what kind of people are in the area. So you don't have control over the conditions, right? So it can't be that. You can't say, well, let's just have people encounter diversity when they're 4, right? Well, how are you going to, you're going to make a program? You're going to make a system? You can't really do that, right? And people have tried that and it gets a backlash, right? So you can't do that. So what you have to do is instead say, okay, what are the capacities that allow people to be able to approach people as other? Oh, because here's the other trick. There's actually plenty of otherness in anyone you encounter. There is no, like, even people you think are like you are not, actually. You just need to draw that out and encounter it. I call that the shock of the surprise of difference. It's the shock, like, the way Leibniz describes it is 2 things that you think are the same are those that if you brought together, similar things are things, and I'll give it to you, Aspasia. Similar things are things that you confuse as the other when they're apart, that when you bring together, you see they're different. That's what similar things are. Well, that means when you bring them together, you find out a shock. Oh, I thought they were the same, but actually they're only similar, right? So actually, there's always otherness even in people that are similar. So you don't need to say, oh, well, let's get a white collar, blue collar, this religion, that, then we'll know we'll have diversity. No, the material is there in any configuration of people if you can bring it out. Now, how do you bring it out? Well, this is conversation technology and stuff like that, but I'll pause. Aspasia, please.
I was just going to say, this sounds like dinner table conversation, family. Yeah. Yeah. No. Really, all that's burgeoning within me. So please feel free to continue, Daniel. Is just essentially what you're saying, but in different words. Just how clear it is to me right now that sort of relationships are these purposeful inviters of anxiety. I actually, like, when I say anxiety, I'm talking about the good range, right? Like, they really are. If you're doing relationship right, there will be anxiety. Maybe not every interaction, but there'll be anxiety at times. And I think that we've gone too far down the level of safety and again, I want to be clear, I'm talking about anxiety in a particular range. I don't think it's okay for people to be dissociated and things. But there is a level of that I see in many clients of cutting off people in their life very quickly now. I mean, you see this when they're dating and all sorts of things. Just the minute there's some anxiety, cut off. That's not good for me. That's not safe. I need to find relationships where I always feel safe, and to them that means no anxiety. Now I think there's a difference there. It's actually, how does this person support you in the anxiety? Like, how do the two of you wrestle with the anxiety? What does that mean? Right. It's not just noticing anxiety in a relationship. And actually, if the thing that's causing a lot of the anxiety is also living within you, then you kind of just running away from yourself. Again, we go back to the mirroring aspect. But yes, this is the mechanism through which relationships really are the deepening kind of agent, if we call it that. The deepening of deepening might be the wrong word. Maybe it's the opening up. Because and so starting to read that anxiety in relationship as being an opportunity. Again, we're going back to as being this opportunity. Something is happening here that is up against the limits of what I am consciously aware of, or and how do I want to meet that? And how can I meet that with this other person? And how willing are they to do this with me? And That's the dancing component, I guess. And this all links to the surprise as well, right? This is the actually entering relationship with the hope and the willingness that there will be times when this brings up the surprise within us, right? So even if it's, again, even if it's your partner who you've been with for, you know, decades, that you are willing to engage in a manner that still allows that surprise. Now, some of this surprise, the signal of some of the surprise might actually be this kind of anxiety we're talking about in some situations. Might be this healthier range anxiety. It is kind of the spark that's going off, going, oh, what, something's happening here. You know, there's sort of there's a failure maybe to compute given what the current conscious awareness is. And so reorienting to anxiety in that respect in relationships and actually trying to see that as one way that relationships can be going well, if we put it in those simple terms, I think is really helpful. Again, just because I know this will go on the internet, I just want to state, I'm not suggesting you should be choosing to enter relationships that are flooding you with anxiety constantly. But distinction. But yeah, there is a way that we can come up. Yeah, the anxiety can emerge in relationships all the time, and that we can see it as an invitation of coming up against the limits. And this sort of links to something too. No, actually, I'll leave it there. Daniel, I'm aware that you were maybe still going when you passed it to me. If you want to keep going, and also Seth, you haven't spoken for a while. Maybe you
I'm going to say one thing here, and maybe I can resist the temptation and then see where the momentum goes. But just one simple thing that came to me listening to you right now is, maybe it'd be useful for me to stop saying, do I like this person or not? Or is this my kind of person or not? And start saying, what kind of a dyad are we? And then saying that again for each new person I meet, which just means that whatever sort of natural fit is or isn't, or appears to be there or not in the beginning, there's an assumption of responsibility that I bring into each situation. So it's like, if I have a story, this person is aggravating me, you know, maybe part of the story that starts to rise is, how am I showing up with this person that's making this so aggravating? So it's not that I just assume that you and I together are an organism. And, you know, you and I together today, we were a different organism last week, but really, I don't know, that just strikes me like that could be a useful question. Maybe at least I'll remember it and test it out as I go on through my week.
I love that. Go, Daniel, you're bursting.
I think it is very dangerous to ask, do I like the person? Do I like this? Do I like this? Because it's all about you and egotistical. Basically, just pay attention.
Sorry. But also, I think the truth is that you probably like and dislike everyone.
Yes, that's the problem, is whenever you ask that, you naturally bring it into algebra. When you must let it unfold, it will always be a mixture. There is no human being you like, you dislike, with the parentheses there together, because nobody likes everyone at all points, because we are human and make mistakes. You shouldn't like someone when they do something bad, right? Or, you know, so the language is very problematic. And what it does is it sets up a structure of understanding that gets in the way of development. So of course the relationship dies because you don't allow the thing to unfold. I think basically you should pay attention, is there music or not? And if there's music there, don't assume you know what that means and start saying, well, that means we're supposed to be married or whatever. Just note there's music and stay there to see where the music goes. And it has a way of naturally leading into different things if you pay attention to it, because when you let the music go, you're letting the experience lead the thought. So keep your thought out of the relationship, pay attention to the experience, and dial yourself and condition yourself to make the music continue to occur. And if the music's not there, well, then that's okay. That doesn't mean they're a bad person. That means it wasn't there, right? And so paying attention to that, you know, Jochen and Javier, Michelle, they were mentioning Geopedia, paying attention to that flow, paying attention to the music. Is there music or not? And basically paying attention to is there music or not is a pretty good guide for about everything. Is there music when you read it? Is there music here or not? Is there a music for a relationship? And don't say what that means. Don't say there's music, therefore I'm supposed to do this forever. Therefore, this is the best book ever written. Don't say anything. Just follow the music. Just listen to the music. Improv with the music,
We
basically.
can keep dancing. It means we can keep
Yeah,
dancing. The music
yeah.
stops.
Just stay with the music. And stay in that mode of improvisation.
Another thing that came to me a little earlier, but you're reminding me of it now, is when we're in the sort of algebraic. You were speaking at some point, Aspasia, about the diagnosis, right? And it seems to me one thing that the diagnosis does is it takes this problem out of my hands. Because when I tell you, you're this, now I'll send you to that specialist. And it so I think there's a question of responsibility here too that I feel like we've been talking about. But I mean, to welcome the anxiety or to ask what is my role in making the music, or the feeling that the music just ground to a halt, it is a sense of responsibility. And I think that and I've been thinking in the background, I don't like being pessimistic, but when we talk about the school reform and all of these things, I'm thinking it all makes sense to me. And I see large forces that are moving very quickly in the opposite direction of what we're talking about. So part of where maybe just to make sense of my own life, where I go is like, how can I live my daily life differently? Which is not to say that I don't want to see the oral exams in schools and all of these things, but I'm a little afraid that this is not what our children are being trained in right now. And it's not where, like AI is going into the classroom, and God only knows, but I don't think it's gonna, I'm worried. I think it could be done many ways, but I don't think that the way it's going to happen is likely to be the best one. And so on another level, maybe it's a little darker, but this is the other way I see anxiety, is kind of like the dissonance is going to get louder, is my sense of things. And so on the one hand, I think it's just important to say, let's get past the idea that we're going to eliminate the anxiety, but also, like, honestly, I think it's going to get louder,
I agree. In the question, like, there could be something about the problem of spread that requires it getting louder as a forcing function, or else people don't spread, right? So, there's a grace in these sort of things potentially. A few things before I forget. One may hear what I said about listening to the music and don't name it and say, oh, so you never commit, you never make a claim. Understanding has to be on the other side of facing a fear. Usually in a relationship, you're afraid not to name it. And that's when you shouldn't. But eventually, as you go with the music, the day comes where you become afraid to name it. You become a name to claim what it is. And now it's time, actually. Like when you follow the music, the method of the decision or bringing it into understanding or name or declaration is a good, really good heuristic, is when it moves to being requiring you to face fear, actually. That tends to be a very good. So music and courage tend to be a important mechanism of, I think, dealing with these kind of things. It's how you have something open, but not afraid to close it. When you have to close it on the other side of fear, that tends to then be sublation. It brings it because you had to change to make the decision. So now you brought it to a higher dimensionality. So music, and then facing fear when you bring it into naming. And that tends to be a pretty good structure. And that gets tied, of course, to anxiety. Because then this whole idea of following the music, that in of itself, I don't understand it. There's a certain anxiety in that. The music, the notes of the music tend to follow facing anxiety, not running from anxiety. Like, you can't make music unless you face the anxiety. And then there becomes a point where the anxiety moves to actually understanding. It flips. And that's when you name. That's when you declare. A few other things. I think that idea that was said, I do think also there's something, perhaps there's like a historical notion here where perhaps one could say that for most of history until our moment, most of our anxiety was a result of not understanding nature. We had harvest, we had farm. There was this sense that the external world was very real and the gods were in control. And there was this, and in that world, You didn't need to have your relationships be the source of anxiety because the world made it. It was a task-based society. And in fact, getting with people who were like you in a tribe to just survive could actually be acceptable, right? The issue is now we seem to be in a historic period where a lot of conveniences and technology has dealt with the anxiety of the unknowns of nature. But the problem is that makes anxiety optional because now you can find it in people, but it's not going to be forced upon you so readily by the facticity of nature or the world. Now, this is a very general picture, and there's, of course, caveats to all of this. But the point is, the problem now is we have to choose how we respond to anxiety. And basically, we're saying you have to choose it in relationship, which kind of historically is a transformation of how relationships were usually used. Perhaps it could be argued that for most of history, relationships were used to create groups to handle big problems, to handle big things. And now we're saying, well, actually, now it's a historical moment where the relationship has to be the source of the anxiety. Unless you want to bring back the big things like world wars and different things, and that's exactly what we're actually doing right now. If you don't choose to make relationships the source of anxiety, then something's going to be the source of it. And it's going to be a return of the, as I've heard said, the strong gods, which is not good. But I really like the phrase,
Oh, that's clear.
relationships are purposeful invitations of anxiety. Yes. Yes. And basically, in order for global pluralism not to destroy us, or the modern world not to lead to self-effacement or a failure of psychological development, that's what you need people to see relationships as. Purposeful invitations to anxiety. All right. Well, if you're looking at the school system and you say, okay, this is a society, therefore people will have relationships. And if relationships are to be purposeful invitations of anxiety, what are we doing with our kids? What are we doing in the education system to make them equipped for those purposeful invitations of anxiety, right? Well, there's certain skills here. There's certain capacities. There's certain people to anxiety. So, for example, do kids have the ability when they interact with somebody to not get nervous, to not be overwhelmed, to actually be able to speak with the person? Do they have improvisational capacities? Do they have emotional capacities? I definitely think most people on planet Earth has never had a real conversation. They've never, ever had a conversation. If you literally gave people the knowledge of what a conversation was when they were young and they knew what that was, that one little thing, and you're not telling them what to do. You're not telling them what religion, what work, what everything. You're just exposing them to conversation and saying, you can do it too. And this is what it looks like. That one little thing would insanely go a long way to actually increasing the probability of people being able to handle relationships as invitations to anxiety. Because if I know how to talk, then when I feel the anxiety, I don't just bottle up, I'm able to walk through it, talk through it, adjust in the discussion, and actually go, oh, anxiety is something I can handle. When you learn how to have conversation, you actually divulge to yourself that anxiety is something I can handle. I'm actually able to handle this. We're actually able to walk through it. Oh, so I don't have to be afraid of it. I don't have to avoid it because I actually can handle it, right? Well, you do that for the average person, this goes a long way right there. And of course, I think most people, we've already said it, and I'll stop, although I have these notes. I'll stop. Most people think you only have a conversation when you know what you're going to talk about. You only open your mouth when we have there's a point to speaking. I know what we're going to talk about. I'm here to give you the relevant information, and then we go beyond. Or I have a certain but most people, honestly, what most people think a conversation is actually an interrogation. Most people are just interrogating one another all day long. What did you do at school today? How was work? What was going on? If you listen to how people speak, it is freaking interrogation. Our society is filled to the brim with interrogation to get the relevant information, to get what is important and nothing else. This is not conversation, it's interrogation. And that's all you hear all the time.
Mining people for what you need from
Yes, we're mining one another, right? Because it doesn't even occur to us that you would engage in, we don't know how to engage in conversation if we don't know what we're going to talk about. We have no idea how to do it. We sit there awkwardly and say, how's the weather? Oh, look at the game. We'll watch a sports game and talk about that.
but really the thing we're watching is doing our relating for us. It's a third we introduce. We don't know how to bring a third between us that is our own,
that is a mystery or an unknown that we're unfolding together. We have no idea how to do that. We have no training how to do that. Well, if you can't do that, then you're going to have interrogation. And interrogation is power and violence, and it feels bad, and people don't like it. Or the only way you might be able to respond to it is more of the psychotic with the frivolous talk, or a certain joke, a certain frivolity of conversation, right? Light, keeping it light, right? Keeping everything at a certain frivolity, right? Well, then you got to avoid the depths. You got to avoid the things that you need to bring out that you're not bringing out to develop, right? Neither of those is going to work. And our school system and our culture has done absolutely nothing to put the idea in people's heads that this isn't what the word conversation means. When I say people need to converse and communication means, it doesn't even occur to people that there are options beyond frivolity and interrogation. And under those conditions, no, people aren't going to be able to handle anxiety because you can't deal with anxiety by interrogating it. That just makes people bottle up. That worsens it. And you can't deal with it by being frivolous because you're avoiding it. You have to be able to talk about something that you don't know what you're talking about ahead of time. You have to be able to have an exploratory mode in discussion. You have to be able to unfold a thought and see where it goes without getting anxious along the way or bailing out or exiting. That's what most people do. They're like, I don't know, and they leave. They exit, they shut down. If they don't have the capacity to follow the unfolding of a thought, then no, we can't deal with anxiety. And yeah, we need to introduce that to kids as soon as possible in the school system, not because we're telling them what to believe, what to think, what religion, what economy. No, you're giving them the capacity to know what a conversation is, and if they don't know what that is, we cannot respond to anxiety correctly. It will devour us. And if it devours us, then global pluralism ain't gonna work. So yes, we need to introduce it as soon as possible.
Yeah, that right there, right? That's the architecture for which we are helping people to reorient to anxiety.
yes.
Yeah, the conversation and getting it in young. Yeah. Yes. On the no, Seth, have you got anything? I don't want to.
I was just enjoying the moment of silence. I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot, and I was thinking like you before Aspasia that this very conversation, I was very clear that I didn't know what we were talking about at the beginning, but you know, it's fun to wonder, you know, you take three human beings and they think about stuff and they think about stuff and then they think about stuff and then you say, get on a Zoom call. And then, you know, it's messy. And then patterns start to emerge, and then we start to, you know, I mean, what's really interesting for me, I've heard Daniel speak about this sometime, and I feel like we have touched on it a bit here, is the question of scale. And I feel it in the conversation. Like sometimes I feel like I'm talking about something where I'm just, I think I'm making a good point, but it feels like it's all pie in the sky. It doesn't feel practical. And then in another moment, I get excited because I say, oh, I could apply that, you know, and that for me is part of what you were speaking to, Daniel, in terms of like, I don't know what this is about. But, you know, if we spend enough time in the confusion, you know, you get those little nuggets, and they might be different for the other person in the conversation. But something kind of coheres. And so, and that's the thing that I start to have faith in over time in these conversations, right? I mean, I don't, we really did spend more time, I think, than usual at the beginning saying, well, where do we want to go here? But it never occurred to me like, well, maybe this is just the wrong night. Let's just log off, you know? And so, but there's even an anxiety there, right? Like if we keep going, I mean, imagine going on a date with someone and I think they're really attractive, but I really don't know what to say. But maybe if we could just keep sitting there, not knowing what to say, what to say, that actually reveals something like we're willing to sit here not knowing what to say. Exactly. You know, maybe there's something else, you know, below the surface that's drawing us in. And then if you I mean, if you hang out with those very, very vague outlines of things, that's when they start to look more like forms. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know what I'm saying now. This is what's coming up.
But
So
that's part of the. But no, I'm so sorry. But that's the faithful.
Presence. Like you come, you commit, you're in the faithful presence. Because if the thing that arises, you knew it was going to rise, then it would just be egotism, it would be understanding. The thing has to come out of a certain uncertainty to be a pattern, that kind of convergence, that kind of coming out. The fact that it comes through that methodology then gives you reason to actually think this is more of a form than it is a mere notion, that it actually is forming as you're going, which if the entire discussion is in many respects that the proper address to anxiety is the faithful presence of the emergence of that form, that anxiety takes you out of the spaces where you can have form emerge as such, that then is geometry by which you can form yourself to higher dimensionality, well, then that's isomorphic with the notion that is being discussed, right? And so that inability to have a certain faith in the faithful presence, you don't know what's going to discuss, but actually that is the precondition for the thing to arise. Like that's a kind of commitment that opens conditions of possibility. And like you say, it says something. It's like, oh, what kind of person is willing to sit with me not knowing what we're going to speak about? That says something about their character. Oh, you're putting the experience before the thought. You're saying, I will enter into an experience with this person, and then we'll think about it. Not, I know what we're going to say, because that's putting thinking ahead of the experience, right? You're literally saying, okay, we'll put the experience first and see what occurs. Well, that's geometrical now. That's actually making a space for apprehension versus calculation. And basically, apprehension is only possible where there's the possibility of anxiety. And those who face anxiety, the gift is apprehension, as distinct from calculation. If you are willing to face anxiety, you can gain this capacity of apprehension. If you are not, you do not get it. And the apprehension is critical for the human to be human. So I really like what you were saying, Seth.
And it's intimacy too, right? Like that is much more intimate to just sit with someone on a first date, just giving into the fact you don't know what to say, as opposed to trying to do the polished performance and the surface level. Let me say the things I've pre-planned and give this person a really good impression of me. So which is the opposite. You're actually So it's linked to intimacy as well, and that's oftentimes for a large majority of us, part of what creates anxiety is intimacy.
Yes.
And I think that we don't have a proper understanding of the word intimacy, just as a collective human group. And a lot of what we're talking about here too is, I imagine, helping people to become more acquainted with intimacy. And so that intimacy, because for many people, I think that is the very thing that leads to overwhelming, flooded anxiety. And so again, I don't want to mean that we can get people to a place where they'll never feel any anxiety the more intimate that they become with people. But I think, again, if we can start to make some of these shifts in the schooling, as an example, get in early, then that will also have huge flow-on effects for intimacy and relationship as well moving forward. People's ability to be with it, to be more emotionally intimate. I think we're just talking about all the same things. Just want to throw that word in. Because it takes great courage and great intimacy to just sit in silence with someone, or to even just some of the things that just to even name. Oh I just went blank. Like not try to pretend it didn't happen and skate over it. Yeah.
I think intimacy is extremely tied to it, and also the faithful presence. Like, yeah, we're just going to get together and see what happens. Like that is a certain
trust in possibility that is a testament to intimacy. And it speaks to a certain sort of magic. It speaks to a certain sort of like, oh, we get together and things just occur. But you see, that is on the other side of the willingness to sit in silence. Like, you don't get the people are dating now looking for that magic on the first date, right? If you find it is probably performative, right? It has to be on the other side of the anxiety. It has to be on the other side of the imperfection, because then it's anti-fragile. If you get that magic on this side of the anxiety, you don't know. It's a Schrodinger's cat. You don't know if it's fragile or anti-fragile, right? You want to make sure it's on the other side of it, right? Well, But once you get that magic, what ends up happening is you start becoming nervous of the test. So you start avoiding it. Let's not talk about religion and politics. Let's keep it in dating, right? Like there's a real danger in tasting, dare I say, magic on this side of anxiety versus the other side. Because once you taste it, you're then not going to want to lose it. But then you're not going to, but not losing it on this side of anxiety means not developing. And that's setting you up for a real heartbreak when inevitably the real breaks in, as Lacan, when inevitably the day comes where turns out you can't avoid anxiety forever. Better to go on and accept you're not going to avoid it, and then to make the school system accept it's not going to avoid it and have people learning for it, right? We basically have a society that is still believing it is possible to avoid anxiety. We have dating cultures that believe it is possible to, and is actually, those are the skills we're developing, avoiding anxiety. And it's a repression, it's a denial that is setting people up for failure. I mean, the thought that was coming to mind, and then I'll stop, is that like it's very interesting to me. I'm of the opinion that basically if you don't learn to converse, and I think conversing as I'm describing is strongly tied to intimacy, you eventually face that. And I think it occurs as you get older. Because as you get older, and maybe you retire or different things, you're going to find out if you learn to converse or not, right? When you get married and you're alone in the world, you're going to find out if you learn to converse or not. You are only going, like, you eventually come to this realization that you learned how to converse and commune with another person or not, right? And that will come out not just in marital, but friendships. And as you get more time, maybe as you get older and you retire, the revelation is coming that you will learn this or not. And there's a sense in which AI has a certain grace because it's going to force people to ask if they learn this or not before retirement. And it might actually save them from that day when they're too old and they've used all the time in a manner that did not help them gain those capacities, right? Like, you are going to be alone in a room with another human being. You are going to be in conversations with people. You will find out if you learn to converse and create intimacy or magic or not. You will find out, right? It's coming. And so if you accept that and you say, that's inevitable, so I'm going to actually face anxiety now because the ability to learn that conversation and to actually gain those capacities is in the facing of that anxiety, well, then you're not in denial. You're just accepting what is going to occur. And you will be very glad you did. You will be very glad you did. Because if you get to be 60 or 70 or whatever and you haven't, then it's much harder to change, I think. Because then there has to be a sort of looking at the decisions you made in the past as being wrong, and you don't want to do that, and we have our habits, and we got this far. Why do we need to change now? Don't do that. Don't freaking do that. Learn this conversing that is on the other, that also gives you a certain magic on the other side of anxiety, because that does create intimacy, and it's not good to not have that in life.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautifully said. I'm aware of time and wrapping up. I know it's been like you guys. I also do have to do something. But
I don't think you anxious that awareness of time. Careful.
oh,
Yeah, this is really good. Really like this one.
yeah, me too. Yeah,
I
I would say too. This is probably the first conversation I've had of this kind, where I haven't felt my usual kind of periods of flooding of anxiety at all. And so, I think that's relevant too. I mean, there's been, and it does link to, partly what we're talking about today. There has been a lot happening in my life over the last few weeks that I have been quite flooded with anxiety. And it is in the interrogation of that more deeply that I finally do. That I stumbled across a whole new pattern of things that helped me to understand what was happening to me. Again, just like layers, like you just never, you just I continually surprise myself about myself. And it's only through, exactly like we've been talking about, it's only through being in relationship with people that that can occur, that I can come up against all of that happening, and then I can figure out what's going on here. And then also through having such wonderful relationships where I can actually, even within the relationship, explore it further.
Yep.
And in doing all of that, it is significant. This is the magic of it. It has just significantly, automatically, without me doing anything, significantly reduced the levels of anxiety that I am feeling,
Yes.
even here, right?
Yes.
There is nothing scary about either of you. You know, I love you both very much, and yet, you know, I would come onto these calls and. Sure. Especially if I press the record button, straight away, here we go. And like, it would go in waves, you know, and I'd be getting ready to talk and, oh, here it comes again. And it's just, you know, and, you know, you can learn to be with it differently, sure. But it's quite extraordinary how there is the unearthing of more about what that tells you about what's going on for you, and being able to link that to an earlier injury in life, if you call it that. And make sense of it through the prism of earlier relationships that can transform what manner in which my body now metabolizes seeing the two of you on the screen as being as a lesser anxiety provoking stimulus in and of itself. And it is, it's the invitation to intimacy, it's the invitation to discuss, knowing that, you know, it's going to go online and all of these things. Yeah, created all sorts of anxiety that I knew and understood as anxiety, and I could have theories and hypotheses about what that might be pointing to, but they were theories and hypotheses. And then, you know, the manner in which I was finally able to, and it did come through just emotional experience, and just finally I was waiting, it was bubbling away, and I was waiting, and then finally when it was ready to emerge, I just tried to let it and just see it, everything, and just let it, and just through emotionally experiencing on the other side, it was really quite obvious to me what it was all about. And something that is so, again, I don't want to go into the details just because it's YouTube and everything, but the details of which were so are so obvious to me now. And yet if you asked me a week ago, I wouldn't have pointed out that particular dynamic when I was younger as an example, as being relevant to me. It's just, it still amazes me when all of this happens. So yeah, it's just been, I just thought I would share that on the tail end, but it's, yeah, I so love meeting with both of you and speaking with both of you, and yeah, today's been quite a treat to not be flooded at any point with anxiety. It's been lovely. Lovely.
You know, when you were speaking right now, I was just imagining, because you and I have talked about this, and all three of us, you know, at a certain point had never done one of these and put it out on the internet. But I was just sort of imagining if people listen to these, and if there's someone who's never been in one of these conversations, never recorded it, never put it on the internet. I mean, people do that for all kinds of reasons and content creation, blah, blah, blah. But I think this is kind of an important practice. It's not like, you know, I don't expect 20,000 people to see this, but I also know that some people will see it, you know, and so there's a certain exposure here. There's also a containment, because I don't see any of those people on this Zoom call. I just see, you know, these two people that I'm familiar with. But yeah, I felt it in this conversation, you know, just that, oh, okay, this is not like the conversations I've been having throughout the day or throughout the week. I have to get into a different mode to do this with the two of you. So, you know, people have different situations in their daily lives, but the internet is actually a place where you can, I think, jump into this, you know. Look under the caption of this video. Like probably you've got 3 people here who would talk to you if you're curious about any of what we've said. But it just is touching to me to hear you say that. But I kind of thought, well, let's not just think of, you know, Aspasia as being vulnerable for a moment. I think this too is a process of people getting together on Zoom, you know, recording it, putting it out there, which is really important. And I think actually is one form of inviting, you know, maybe not too much anxiety, but some, you know, enough for me to dance with it. And that's really valuable.
Yes, and that's actually what, you know, I don't know that it was necessarily conscious, but I look back on it and I'm very thankful for, is that, you know, despite, you know, these conversations still making me very anxious when I'm in them, that doesn't, I return to them time and time again. It never cut off my desire to want to continue to do them. And that's the authentic resonance bit, I think. Like, you know, there was just it never crossed my mind.
Desire to continue going despite anxiety.
Yeah, like I didn't see it
there. You know?
Yes, because they're 2 different things, right? That's the whole, but there's a whole different signal that lets me know this is important, I want to do this. And it has nothing to do with the fact that sometimes I'm getting flooded with anxiety in these conversations. That's very uncomfortable. I also have this whole meta thing of being annoyed by that, and why can't I figure that out and reduce that a little, you know, which increases the anxiety, as in I'm self-attacking. There's a whole thing, but you know, but there are, yeah, I think that signal, for whatever reason, is still alive and strong for me, at least as it pertains to these conversations. And it's been a remarkable part of opening up for me to be part of these conversations and to meet the two of you, and to be doing all of this, because I wasn't doing this like 2 years ago at all. So, you know, I agree with you, Seth. Maybe that is a good place for like a next conversation or something, really trying to distinguish. It's some separate thing. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at around authentic resonance, is that like that's some separate signal that lets me know to continue to engage in the dance. I still want to continue to engage in the dance, even though I can notice all these complex mixed feelings about doing it and towards all the different people, and, you know, and all of that. And it takes a substantial chunk of time, you know, and you're right, it's rare for me. I don't spend, you know, 2.5 hours sitting down and talking really much at all, just in the current pace of my day-to-day life. So it's a pleasure and it's a gift.
It is a pleasure and it is a gift, and
it's anxiety provoking.
Yeah, what's that, Aspasia?
And it's anxiety provoking.
Yes. Well, there's a very real
sense in which you would not need authentic resonance if there wasn't anxiety. Like, anxiety is why authentic resonance is relevant, and it is the signal through the anxiety.
Yes.
And as we become a society that is more, quote unquote, anxious because of the loss of givens, it becomes more pressing, right? This authentic resonance. When anxiety was more based on the unknowns of nature, you needed the skills of being able to read nature and survive. But there's a certain authentic resonance that has this relational quality that is fitting for our age. And it is, if there was no anxiety, you wouldn't need, authentic resonance is for anxiety, quote unquote, which means it's for it, it's pro-anxiety, and it's also an address of anxiety. So authentic resonance is for anxiety. I guess I would also just say quickly is that this practice is incredibly important. For this, the social coordination mechanism allows ways of people to be exposed to anxiety at a gradual rate, to talk as if it is not public while also being public. You're allowed to have these between spaces that allow certain development that I don't think was infrastructurally afforded before. Because, like, you'll have people, if you get too much exposure too quickly, it destroys you. If you get no exposure at all, it destroys you. If you put content online that's just you speaking, you become a celebrity. But this is a conversation between three people and you don't know what you're talking about, right? There are all these ways that you're creating content that is avoiding
ways that content creation
tended to go that would be very problematic. And you're also creating something that's very interesting in history. You're creating artifacts of overhearing conversation. For most of history, it's very difficult to overhear a conversation. You just happen to be in the bar, and it's kind of rude to eavesdrop, right? We are literally inviting overhearing now, right? I would argue that overheard conversation is one of the most useful ways subjectivity can form and a person can form, because it allows them to be in a conversation without feeling the pressure of responding, to hear and to learn things they otherwise may not. We are like, what you're creating is kind of content that allows overhearing conversation. And this has not been really possible for most of history. But I would argue that many of the best forms of education created opportunities for the elites or the rich or whatever to overhear conversations. If you were in higher echelons of society, you could overhear conversation, and overhearing conversation was actually a critical dimension of education. Now it's democratized per se. It's available to everyone. This is a huge deal. Education, not as lecture, but overheard conversation. I think overheard conversation is more powerful than lecture because it is not so pointed. It is more, you're actually training apprehension because things are flowing over you and it's training apprehension, not memorization. So the overheard conversation that is now being put on online is a big deal, huge deal. The last thing I'll say is, on this idea of surprise, when you come into these discussions and you don't know where it's going to go, one of the reasons for me it's important to commit to doing these discussions is because I have no reason to believe that there isn't just more to surprise me. like that of myself and my own thought. Every time you've been doing it for years, it's like, oh, that's a new, wow, I've never thought that before. I've never had that sort of thought. It just seemed you experience yourself as an infinite source of things. Dang it. Like you experience yourself as this kind of apathetic endlessness. And you're like, but only in these situations, like you have to put yourself in these conversations. Like it is only in these conditions that you have this experience. And you commit to that. You commit to that. And you say, yeah, I will continue to put myself in those places because there's this thing. And like the problem of scale, Seth mentioned the problem of scale. And the problem of scale basically seems insurmountable, right? It seems completely insurmountable. Well, we keep having these experiences of stuff coming out of us. The only insurmountable problems by definition must be problems that can only be addressed by this stuff coming out of people, like this infinite emergence of ideas, right? The insurmountable problems are probably there is reason to think the insurmountable problems are the problems that could only be answered by networks of people that tap into this apathetic flow in them that until this moment of history could not be coordinated. And now it can be coordinated. So what if what are insurmountable problems were just insurmountable relative to periods of history that didn't have the infrastructure to coordinate these apathetic overflows that people are capable of if you bring them in relation and they're open to one another? So maybe the insurmountable are just ones that need time of apprehension to get a nugget here, oh, this idea, and over here, and it apprehending, right? There's no reason to assume that's not the case. Just because these problems have historically been insurmountable, and maybe ultimately they are insurmountable, but if you say they are insurmountable, then you're making an assumption. That's a presupposition. That's a certainty that you are not warranted to have. And just by the experience of these conversations online where you're seeing this apathetic, just endlessness that just comes out of people, if that is what people are capable of, and that is what we're seeing can occur, then there is reason not to assume these insurmountable problems are actually insurmountable. They're just matters of time, and matters of time are matters of commitment. And so we just need to commit to the matter and keep on in that commitment.
Which links perfectly to sum it all up to what I was thinking earlier, but I didn't have a chance to really bring it in. You were talking about dancing, and you're talking about sort of, that people might give you the critique of, oh, that means you never commit or, declare, but to me, that is what authentic resonance is. It's kind of the signal that lets you know, like that is
Yes.
the declaring, the committing or the not or the whatever. But in the meantime, we can just dance. If that makes sense. I unfortunately have an insurmountable problem now, and I must called an appointment. And
Yes.
and I must depart. I'm also amazed that the two of you are still awake. Oh,
Of course.
This was great. Thank you both.
It was a treat.